You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 3, Kidnapping, by R.A. Consul.
Chapter 26. Backup. Deciding to stay and help Marie was a fine and noble act, but did not suddenly confer any great ability to do so. Kuro was neither a warrior nor a shrewd negotiator. He was hardly even a wizard. He was a thief. Any help he could provide would be limited to hiding and taking things that didn't belong to him. It wasn't clear how burgling the royal kitchen could improve anyone's situation, but he had to start somewhere. He raided the stores of spreads and breads, collected cookware and utensils, and briefly considered looting the enormous collection of knives. It seemed prudent to arm himself, but he couldn't imagine actually using them to fight. He was more likely to hurt himself than anything else. More usefully, however, the palace had an entire barrel of salt. So valuable it was kept under lock and key. Not very good locks, as it turned out, because they fell away to Kuro's picks in seconds. He filled a bucket and added it to the growing larder in his bag, and then stared at the remaining salt. He could use it to remove his bracelet. If he did, though, the already slim chances of him being allowed to go back to school vanished. The bracelet was the only thing allowing him to pretend to have a normal life. If, however, he allowed Marie to get hurt just to hold on to that masquerade, could he find any peace in that life? While he had been equipping himself, the argument in the throne room had intensified. A shout from Sir Bors echoed through the halls. "Protect the Queen!" he bellowed. Kuro took that order as being meant for him. He plunged his hand into the salt and pried the offending object from his wrist. He retrieved the bangle and observed its now inert runes. With the bracelet removed, he could feel the west wind gather around him once more. At first it was just a fluttering against his neck, a tentative touch, as if uncertain he were really there. Then, unloading months of pent-up affection, she knocked him flat on his back before nearly squeezing the breath from him. She whirled around him, running up his front and down his back. She caressed his face and danced along his scalp before settling around him, as if snuggling up to rest on his chest. There was no time for an exchange of affections, but he couldn't help but soak in the moment. "I missed you too," he whispered. A sudden outbreak of nearby violence ruined their reunion. The clashing of sword against sword echoed through the palace, accompanied by the orchestra of crackles and booms, indicating two knights facing off with all their power. The din of the duel, now apparently underway in the throne room, masked the rapid approach of several slippered feet until they were nearly in the kitchen. Instinct took Kuro, and he was hiding inside a cupboard before he realized it. Then, through the space between the doors, he saw the regent leading Marie to the labyrinth at speed. "This way, your majesty," he wheezed. "You should be safe down here." With Ein tied up dueling Bors, Kuro was the only one left to help Marie. Kuro followed the fleeing pair through the labyrinth, staying silent and hidden by the pure darkness that filled the maze. He was blind, but the wind led him faithfully, keeping him just in earshot of their footsteps. Footsteps that slowed to a halt and were replaced by talking. "At last," said the regent, his voice filled with excitement rather than the mortal fear one might expect when running from dueling knights. Kuro slowed to a crawl as he approached a corner around which light was spilling. Lying flat on the floor to be well below eye level, he risked a single glance down the illuminated corridor. It was the hall containing the royal vault, and the door was open. That door had defeated him because the final lock could only be opened with a drop of royal blood freely given, something which Kuro had always lacked. Its opening removed any doubt of Marie's legitimacy. From within the vault came a rhythmic shuffling of feet and giggles of almost childlike glee. Kuro inched closer, keeping to the shadows, using the sounds of celebration to mask his movements. He dared not look directly into the vault, but the polished inner surface of the open door reflected some of the interior. Inside, an elderly man with an irresponsibly long beard pranced about merrily, picking things up and trying them on, all while singing, "At last, at last, at last," to himself. Though the reflection was imperfect, it could only be the regent. His unrestrained glee at gaining access to the treasures of Tirnanog shattered any thought that he might be an innocent party in Marie's kidnapping. He wasn't a loyal retainer, but a thief. Much more difficult to discern because of her complete lack of motion was Marie. Crowned and dressed in royal regalia, she stood in the middle of the vault like a statue. "So much to choose from," said the regent. "But we must keep our priorities, mustn't we? There's no need to get greedy." "Of course, Lord Mordred," came the reply. It was Marie's voice without question, but her bland Montreal accent had been replaced with the crisp formality of a Tirnanog royal one. More than just the accent, she sounded noble, condescending, as though she'd been taking lessons from Evelyn. Phineas, Kuro thought. That was the only explanation for Marie's transformed voice and manner. The space left when her memories had been taken for the holidays had given him a blank canvas on which to paint a perfect princess. Plans. Kuro needed plans, and quickly. "Excuse me," he said, stepping into the vault a few moments later, blocking their doorway to departure. "You!" the regent shouted. It was an odd exclamation. In a single syllable, the man had moved from shocked anger through indignant annoyance to something approaching celebratory delight. Kuro took a moment to observe the vault. There were piles of valuables, cash, coins, and gems, enough to embarrass a dragon. One whole wall was a library, occupied by tomes of spellcraft too precious and powerful to allow the public to access. Opposite were racks displaying the regalia of war, blades, spears, wands, and shields. Also displayed on labeled pedestals, the thick bracelets that would transform into the incredible works of magical art, which were the armors of the Knights of the Sun. He paused briefly at the two plinths labeled Lamorak. On one, two bands of tarnished bronze, brown and blue. The other, two bracelets of polished black glass with a faint inner glow, as though a river of lava were flowing deep within. Finally, there was a collection of oddments, things of no clear value. Paperweights, chess pieces, the withered remains of a half-eaten sandwich, and numerous personal effects like watches and rings. All were neatly organized by the magic of the vault. Although it had been sealed for 15 years, preventing anything from being removed, it still accepted deposits. Several of those odd items Kuro had inserted himself while attempting to decipher a way into the vault, but many were not. He had not been the only one attempting to breach the door. In a space so teeming with treasures, the empty spaces stood out. There were only two places where objects appeared to be missing. The first was a gap in the otherwise tightly packed shelves, which indicated a small book had been removed. There was no indication as to its purpose or contents, only the void where it had been. The other was entirely the opposite. The most prominent position in the vault, a pedestal emblazoned with the royal coat of arms clearly meant to hold the royal armor, was empty. Marie appeared to be little more than another treasure in the room. She stood like a mannequin dressed in the royal crown, cape, and scepter. He couldn't linger long in his observations, as the regent was selecting which implement of destruction to threaten him with, like a connoisseur choosing a wine from a rack of the finest vintages. "I'm very sorry," said Kuro, "but I need to rescue Marie if that's okay. You can keep looting if you want." Queen Marie scoffed at the suggestion. "What absolute nonsense," she said. "Lord Mordred, defend me from this scoundrel." The regent chose a spear with a tip shaped like a sharpened maple leaf, which left a trail of flame as it swept towards Kuro. In response to his shock, the wind gusted, staggering the regent before he struck and slamming the vault door. It clanged shut, but drifted open again of its own accord. "Did you think that would lock us in here?" said the regent, saluting Kuro's effort. "And then what? We starve to death together?" "No, sir," said Kuro. "You just startled me." "I'll choose to believe you," laughed the regent. "As a courtesy, I prefer not to damage you, in all honesty. He held the tip of the spear at Kuro's chest. It would be a terrible waste. You're as unique as anything in this vault. That was an odd thing to say, Kuro thought. Am I? Of course, my boy, said the regent, as if he were proud of the fact. You're a natural thief, gifted wizard, and looten enough for them to anchor you. Those words, that tone, they were uncannily familiar, but they were coming out of the wrong body with the wrong voice. The warden had said exactly the same thing. It seemed impossible, but the similarity was undeniable. Roche? Kuro asked. The regent lit up with delight. Well done, my boy! Very well done! I'm impressed, genuinely impressed. Despite the open admission of his identity, it still didn't make any sense. Kuro briefly entertained the idea that the man was living a double life, but that couldn't be. He would regularly need to be in two places at once, and the regent was well known to rarely, if ever, leave the palace. He remembered the regent's office and thought about how very like the warden's it was. They were both sanctuaries from the places their inhabitants ran, filled with treats and treasures, comfortable lounging space, and multiple games of chess ongoing with unseen opponents. The warden, claiming to be Roche, had mentioned competing to place someone on the throne, but not with whom he was in competition. Could it be that several people claimed the name of Claudius Roche? Were they using it like a title and fighting to be the leader of the Claudius Club? That made a kind of sense, but didn't explain just how similarly the two men spoke. In any case, while it was confusing, his true identity was not immediately important. I'm not really, said Kuro. Not what? Asked Roche with piqued curiosity. A natural thief, Kuro explained. I had to learn it, and it took a lot of work. He picked up a stray coin from the floor by his feet and slowly strolled out of easy reach of the spear. I was just a beggar for a long time, but there were other pickpockets around, and I watched them. The best, though, were the magicians, the strays who did fake magic. With a little flourish, he opened his hands to show the coin had vanished, then reached up and snatched it out of thin air. The regent, claiming to be Claudius Roche, gave a little nod of approval for the skillful sleight of hand. I must have watched their shows 100 times before I started to see how they did their tricks. They made it look like they were doing things wizards couldn't do themselves, but it was all about controlling where people were looking. He waved his hand in front of the coin, and it was transformed into one of the Lamorak armor cuffs. He waved again, and the second one appeared. Roche appreciated that trick somewhat less. He swung the leaf-tipped spear back at Kuro. A fine performance, my boy. Now hand those over and keep your hands off the rest of the goods. Kuro obediently passed him the cuffs, which quickly disappeared into a pocket hidden within the regent's billowing robes. In a way, I should thank you, Roche said. Do you know how difficult it has been to get rid of Bors? That man is absolutely infuriating. I spent the past 2 days trying to get him to leave me alone long enough to come in here. But he would not leave the heir's side. Your bringing Lady Omirius to me was a useful distraction, though with some inconvenient complications. You're not upset that we interrupted Marie's speech? Asked Kuro. How do you know about that? Asked the regent, the tip of the spear dancing around Kuro's nose. The warden told me, said Kuro. The unmitigated gall of that man, the regent fumed. What was he thinking telling you such things? He was planning to have Phineas take the memories, explained Kuro. That is irrelevant. It was grossly irresponsible. Did he release you only to further inconvenience me? I wouldn't put it past him. Do you know what he did to me? He swapped Excaliburs. He's the one that put that fake rock in. It's a lucky thing you found it, or he'd have his choice of heirs on the throne by now. Would that have been bad? Kuro asked. It would have been frustrating, said the regent. I spent 4 years in this palace trying to get into the vault, and he knew that. Having a false heir would have further stymied my efforts. While I salute his gamesmanship, I still consider it ungentlemanly conduct. Kuro had been trying to figure out how and why both men would claim to be Claudius Roche. The pieces didn't fit together in any way that made sense. The regent mentioning he'd been at the palace for 4 years revealed an aspect of the whole thing Kuro hadn't imagined being a part of the puzzle. Himself. Something very specific had happened to the regent around 4 years ago. Kuro had replaced his circlet with a counterfeit one. The same counterfeit circlet the man in front of him was currently wearing, which was not terribly unlike the one the warden wore. They were symbols of office. It was entirely unremarkable for them to always have them on. Claudius Roche was one of the greatest enchanters in the world, and legendarily obsessed with having contingency plans. It seemed he didn't just have backups for his plans, but he'd made backups of himself. The warden and the regent were his duplicates, and the opponents he spoke of were other versions of himself. It also explained why he was so hard to catch. He was simultaneously several people. "You're just a copy," Kuro said. It was such an unexpected outburst that it derailed Roche. It was a ludicrous idea, but Roche's reaction confirmed it. "Now that is simply rude," he said. "Yes, very well done. 5 points to you for figuring it out. But it grieves me to say, as you are perhaps our finest creation, that I'm going to have to eliminate you from the game board." He readied the spear in his hand to thrust, but seemed reluctant to damage Kuro. "Perhaps I should give you a fighting chance, eh? I'll just borrow your failed plan and lock you in here. If you can somehow find a way to escape, I'll concede the match. It will be something of a challenge even for a thief of your exceptional talent, considering I intend to keep hold of the only key." He gestured to Marie to illustrate his point. Or rather, he gestured to the place he had left her, and was vocally upset to find only a pile of royal regalia in her place. It had taken every ounce of the showmanship Kuro had learned from the street performers to hold Roche's attention while he enacted his plan. The slamming of the vault door was merely a noise meant to distract him and cover up the sound of a seashell being crushed. He then had to keep talking long enough for the memories to filter into her head. Autolycus had played his part, sneaking over and guiding the slightly confused Marie out, while Kuro drew focus with antics and accusations. "Well played, my boy," said Roche, his respect for Kuro's performance being insufficient to overcome his anger. He drew back his spear to strike, but again he paused. Not out of reluctance this time, but instead to listen. "What's that noise?" It was a growing chorus of squeaks, a hungry swarm chasing the scent of the palace's finest peanut butter, which had been smeared on the floor outside and carried by a cooperative breeze down into the sewers. "Back up," said Kuro, holding up a mostly full jar. Roche lunged in apoplectic rage, while Kuro was blasted out of the vault by a burst of wind that also shattered the jar, splattering Roche in smooth, aromatic peanut butter. "Time to run," Kuro said, as he slid to a stop outside the vault, where Autolycus and Marie were cautiously creeping away into the darkness. The tide of rodents began to stream around their ankles, flooding into the vault. "This way!" he shouted, grabbing Marie by the hand and Autolycus by the scruff as he dashed past into the darkness.
Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.